Okay, so we're 3/4 of the way there. We need to now get edit working. So we want an edit link in our grid. So we've got 3 columns, the department ID, which is invisible, the name and budget, excuse me, which are visible, and our delete button. So in between the budget and delete, we want an edit column. So we're going to use a different type of column we haven't used before. If I open a tag and type ASP, what we want is a hyperlink field. So this will allow us to create a link inside of the grid. So the first thing we'll do is set the header text. So in the header row it will say edit. We'll set the text of our link to say edit. Now, we want all of the links to go to our department details page, but we also want the unique department IDs appended onto the end of those links. So when our detail page loads, we know which department we need to look up and populate in our form. So we need to set up, we can pass in one or more fields on our link. So there's a property for this that has a really wonky name, data navigate URL fields. We're just going to pass in one field, which is the department ID. And then we need to set up the wonkiest property of all, which is this one. Rather than type it, I'm going to select it, type a D, and select the data navigate URL format string. I can't really believe after 13 years they haven't come up with a better name for this property.
Probably don't want to change it because everyone's used to it.
Probably. So this is where we specify the full format of the link. So it's department details.aspx, department ID equals, and then because we can pass in multiple values, we have to specify from this list starting at 0. So we just only have one value. So if we use that format, 0, if we had department name, that would be ampersand name equals 1, 2, 3, if we wanted to put multiple values on the end of our URL. We'll just pass one value, which will be 0. We may need to set up one more property, but we'll try it this way and see. We don't have to recompile, we've just changed the HTML. The grid's smart enough to know. Just going to see whether this works or whether we need to add something else to it. So we get an edit link. That's actually all we need. So you can see it goes, you can see the status bar at the bottom, it goes to department details, and it will pass in the appropriate ID. So I can go to any record, and I'll get the proper ID being passed. Right, so again, line 18 and 19 is what you need to add to your grid. We don't have to add any C#, it just generates a link. There's no server-side processing going on here. So once our link is working, this page is basically complete now. So we have to add 2 sections of code to our department details page. We've already talked about what we'll have to do on the save button. We're going to have to modify the save button so it can run either an insert or an update. What else do we need to do here? And where should we do it? Yeah, so on load, well, how are we going to know whether or not to populate the fields? So we're going to have to look whether we have a department ID in the URL. If we have a department ID, the user wants to edit, so we need to query the database, look up that record, and fill in the name and budget. If we have no department ID, the user is adding a new record, so we'll just load the blank form. So this is really the same logic that we did when we built our PHP application. We did the same thing. So right now, the only code we have here is doing an insert when the user clicks save. So I'm going to, above this, I'm going to add a new function called getDepartment, singular. So look up the selected department and fill the form. That's what this function will do. So we need some logic now when our page loads. We need some logic that will check the URL. If it was PHP, we'd be using get. We use a slightly different object in ASP.NET to look for parameters in our URL. So here's what we're going to check. We are going to check if not oops, what do I want to check? Sorry, oops. Would help if I could remember my own function. There's my function. So if our string dot is null or empty, so meaning, and here's how we check. Instead of get, we use request.queryString, and we provide the name of the value we're checking for. So I need 2 round brackets. So this will tell us whether we have a department ID value in the URL or we don't. So if it's not null and not empty, then we'll call our getDepartment method. So this is the equivalent of in PHP saying if not empty, $_get_department ID. So if we have an ID in the URL, look up the selected record. If we don't have a department ID in the URL, nothing happens. We're just going to give the user blank page. So now we'll connect to the database if we have to look them up. So the same line of code one more time. So this is the 4th time we've got our using statement. We'll connect. And we're going to write a similar query to the one we wrote for doing the delete. We'll use the existing department ID, except this time we're going to have to pull it out of the URL, convert it to an integer. And then we'll use this sort of query. We'll pass that ID in, and we'll get back a department object that holds the name and budget in the database. So first I'll create a variable called department ID. So we'll take the ID from the URL. So again, request.queryString is the .NET equivalent of $_get in PHP. And we'll convert it to an integer and store it in a variable. So now we know what record we want to look up. So we'll store the ID from the URL in a variable. We'll look up the department. So we'll use our departments model to run a query. We don't want all the departments. We only want it where the ID is equal to the ID in our URL. So we'll select the first record that matches that ID. So now we'll have this variable called DEP. It has the department ID, and after we run this query, it'll also have the name and budget. So how are we going to get the name value and the budget value to show up in our form so the user can change them? So we will pre-populate the form fields. So when we saved, we took the values from the form and we populated our object in memory. Now we're doing the reverse. Our object in memory has the values. We need to put those values onto our form. So we basically want to do the exact reverse of those two lines when we're saving. So we'll set the text property of our name equal to department dot what value should appear in the name box, the txt name. Here are our properties. What are we going to put in the first text box? Yeah, the name property. And then we'll fill the budget and set the text of that to our department dot budget. So we're really just doing, and what else do we have to do here? No, it's already a decimal. Yeah, we have to convert it to a string to set it as a text property. Because it's a decimal, we have to convert it to a string. So it's the reverse in this case. When we're putting it into a text box, it has to be a string. When we're going from the text box, we have to convert it out of a string. So this should populate our form. We're going to connect, we're going to grab the ID, we'll query the database, and then we'll put each property of that into the proper control on our form. So now if I should be able to look up any department and our form gets populated. Now I don't want to click save because our save button is still wired to call the add function every time. So if I click save here, just go back. If I edit this one, let's say I change the budget from 1 to 11 and click save, it's still running add every time. Notice something else interesting. Not only did it run add, but also notice, I'm going to go back and try and edit this. So I changed the budget to 11, right? When it adds the new record, why did it give me a budget of 1?
Because it's still reading from the other test field.
Nope. Nope, good guess. Give you a clue. It has to do with the order of our code, right? When I click the button, right, my button runs on a save click, yet I had typed 11 in that box. Why did it save the value as 1? And what event happens when the page loads? It calls get department. So it will wipe out whatever I typed because page load runs first. So page load calls get department, which puts the old values in the form, and then my save runs.
So do you need to move that code to?
We don't need to move it, but what should we do with it? Do we want this to run every time the page loads?
Now we need to do it so it's fresh with
That's right. Just like we did here, we only want to call our get method if postback is false, meaning the user loaded the page through the URL or clicking a link. They're not reloading, because if the page is reloading, they're saving the changes, right? I'm going to actually run it through the debugger just so that we're clear on what happens. Okay. I'll put a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here, and I'll start my debugger. So when my page is loading for the first time now, well, actually, I'll just do it this way. So I'll go through my departments link. So I want to edit. Here's my third one called test. When I click edit, code checks, do we have a department ID? Yep, it's 15. Okay, so we better call get. Get runs, we query the database, we get the ID. So we populate our text box, our budget, and our name. Okay, so code runs. That's fine. The problem is when I make changes, right? So I change this to 11. When I click save, notice my URL's still here. My get is still here. In PHP, that would get wiped out, but it stays there in .NET. Actually, it would stay the same, stay there in PHP if it was posting to itself. So now page loads. Page load says, do we have an ID? Yep. So now it calls get again. So right now, my budget is 11, but it's going to get changed when get runs. Now my text box says 1 again. And then when get's finished, now my save click runs. So I've overridden the value, the changes that I've made. And now I'm back to the original values, and it's going to call add again with the name of test and a budget of 1. So we need to prevent this. So I'll just take out all my breakpoints. So we're only going to do this check if postback is false. If the form's posted back, we don't want to run get department again. We only want it to run the first time. So if loading for the first time, not posting back, check for a URL. So I'll say if not is post back. So we have two conditions, one nested inside of the other. Okay, so I've added line 18 and the curly bracket on line. So the first line in blue and the last line in blue. The 4 lines in the middle we already had. So we don't want to look up the department if the users click the save button. Otherwise, we're going to wipe out what they're changing. That's a good way to frustrate your user. They don't get an error, and then they're going to come back and say, what happened to my changes? Well, we overwrote them with an order of operations problem. So if I compile it this way, I want to try it again and make sure that at least if I add a new department this time, if I go and edit and then click save, it should have the right values on the form. So I'll go back, I'll edit my last one again. I'll change it to 11. And now at least it didn't overwrite my form values. So that's something we have to be really careful of if we're going to use the same, if we're going to post back to itself. We only want to do the lookup the first time. Now, we still have an issue because now I keep adding all these records. I don't want to keep adding all these records. I want to edit a record. So when I click save, I don't want to do an insert here. Excuse me. So in our save, we need a couple of if statements. Just like we checked on page load, if we have a department ID in the URL, we'll do the same thing on the save, right? If we have a department ID in the URL, it means we're editing an existing record. If we have no ID, we're going to be adding a record instead. So this line is going to have to go inside of a condition. So check for a URL. So again, we'll say if not. So if we have we'll store into a variable the department ID. So we'll grab the URL, the ID number from the URL, and we'll convert it to an integer. We'll store it in a variable. Now we want to populate our department object So we'll write this link query again. So we'll get the ID from the URL. So this should only happen if we're editing and we have an ID in the URL. If we're adding a new record, we don't need to look anything up because there's nothing in the database yet. We're still going to fill the properties the same way. Whether we're adding or editing, we'll need to populate the name from the text box and populate the budget from the budget text box. We don't want to call add every time though, or it will always do an insert. So this line in blue also has to be in an if condition. So we have a few things we could do. Again, we can check, probably the easiest thing is we can just check the request.query string. Another way we could do it is we could move this variable up here, give it a default value of 0, and check whether department ID is 0 or greater than 0. Both would tell us whether we're adding or editing. I'll just stick with the same logic. In this case, I'll say if string.is null or empty. I've removed the exclamation mark. The exclamation mark means it's not empty. In this case, if it is empty, we'll move our add in here. So I'll move that line. The save goes down here. So add if we have no ID in the URL. So if we call save changes without calling add, but we've given an ID property, an ID value, Entity Framework will run an update command instead. It's smart enough to know whether we're adding or updating. But if you call add, it will always automatically run an insert. So we have two checks. If we have an ID, we're going to look up that record first. And if we have no ID, we're going to make sure we call the add function. So now we should be able to update or add, depending on whether we have an ID in our URL or not. We will try. So now if I give this one a budget, and save, actually I'll delete it. I'll try the whole process. I'm going to add, so I'm still able to add a new record now. We didn't break the add. But now the real test will be whether we can update this record without creating another one. So if I put a 3 on the end of the budget, now my record got updated. So our save button can handle both. You could also, so here would be the other option for deciding whether you're adding or editing if you wanted to be a little simpler. You could create your variable called department ID up here and perhaps give it a default value of 0. And then on this line, we can say if we have it in the URL, change the value from 0 to whatever's in the URL. And down here, instead of evaluating your query string, you could just say if department ID is still equal to 0, meaning we started it out at 0, we never found an ID in the URL, so our variable is still 0. So that logic would work as well. This is maybe a little simpler because we don't have to keep using the string or empty function and we don't have to use as many variables. Sorry, as many brackets and quotes. So this would be another way of doing the same logic. That might be a little, actually I think I prefer this as a little simpler. So we'll start it at 0, and if we're adding, we'll keep it at 0. This should still work the same way. So if I go and add, so I can add the department that way, I should be able to edit it. So we can do both. So we only need really 2 files to do create, read, update, and delete in a table. One page that handles the list, and we can do the delete through the grid, and then a form that will do our adding and editing. Does anybody have any questions about the code and what we're doing here? Is there anything here I should go over or doesn't make any sense? I realize you haven't seen this before, so it's new. It's like anything else, the more you work with it, the more familiar it will become.
I'm still having issues with the update area. You just scroll up to that area, so I can look at it.
So this is the update.
Okay, so we're checking for a URL. Then, if it is non-empty.
So if it's not so I initialized my variable to 0.
Yeah.
If we have a department ID in the URL, we're going to change our variable from 0 to whatever number we find in the URL. So, department ID 4. Then we look up that department.
Okay.
We change the name and budget to be whatever the new name and budget are on our form. And then we call save changes. Department ID is no longer 0, so this line won't execute if we have an ID greater than 0. What did you miss?
That whole department ID equals 0.
Right. Yeah. It seems strange and a little counterintuitive. Why do we have to look it up in order to change it or delete it? That's how the entity framework works. You have to populate the object in order to change it or delete it. To my mind, this step shouldn't be necessary. We should just be able to fill the ID, and it should be smart enough to go ahead, but we actually have to query it and populate the full object in order to modify it. I don't exactly know why that is.
Where are we setting the department ID?
Well, right here. So when on save,
Yeah.
I've created a variable and initialized it to 0. So if it's still 0 when we get down to save, we know we're going to need to call add. And if it's greater than 0, it means the user's trying to edit, so we can just do an update.
You could do, if you wanted to, you could do it with the checkbox as well, right? Like rather than doing department URL, like if you do a checkbox and if it's selected, then
It's true, but then the user has to check it.
that's true.
The other thing we could do is we could put it, another way of doing it is you could put a hidden checkbox on, and when the page loads, we could say, when we run get, we could make the checkbox equal to true. So yeah, we could put a hidden control on. Another way I've done it in the past is I put a label on and I make it invisible, and I write the ID in the label. And then I can check the text property of the label. So there's I've done it many ways.
This is probably the best way of doing it, you would say.
Probably. But they would all work.
Can you scroll back to the update area again?
This is the update area.
Okay.
So for your lab, this brings me to your lab. I think I showed you at the start of class, but I'm going to show you the actual instructions for the lab. Okay. So for the lab, you can take your in-class solution. You don't have to build a new solution. Okay, you just add on to what you've done in class already. Okay, so work with yours. You got to make a student's page that has a grid. The student grid will have the headings student ID, last name, first name, and enrollment date. Okay. So it will look pretty much just like this. Okay. It'll have the delete functionality like we just did. And then you'll have the ability to add. So I can add a new student. You don't have to have any paging on the grid. You can just leave that out. We put paging in the department grid. This needs no paging. So all the students. So it should show up. I can see it. I can edit. Don't worry about this part. That part at the bottom.
Enrollment date needs to be in date format, right?
If you can get it, if you can figure out how to do it, great. It's just the data format string. You can format it. If the time shows up, it's fine. I'm not going to penalize you for that. And then I can delete. That's what I did wrong here. So I should be able to create a student, view the list of students, edit, delete. One caution here, and I'll tell you this from my other classes. You can basically do this the quick way and learn nothing, or you can do it the longer way and actually learn something. When you do it the quick way, which is you're going to build the student page and then go, okay, I'm going to grab that function and copy it, and then I'll just paste it in and I'll just try and change the word department to student. Inevitably, when you do this, if everybody in the class, if my instructions were copy it, people will get errors because you'll forget, for example, that if this has to be db dot rather than departments, this will have to be db dot students. So yes, you could copy all the code from today and just change the names, but you're really not going to actually learn how to do this. So my suggestion is use what we've done to look it up, but actually type out and do all the code yourself. That's the only way you're going to get comfortable with it, is to actually do it yourself. Okay? I mean, there's nothing, I can't stop you from copying and pasting, but ultimately you want to be able to go out and say that you know how to do this stuff. So the only way to do it is to actually code it.
And when's this due, this lab?
Monday night at midnight.
Okay.
It's plenty of time. It's half a week. Okay? So build 2 pages. Build students and student details so that I can add, edit, and delete everything. Okay? To submit, you've got, the other thing I'm going to have you do, and this is worth 0.5%, is to push your code to GitHub. Okay? You can choose not to do it, but then you're punting 20% of your mark if you don't put it on GitHub. So you can just zip it up, and if you put it on GitHub, the only thing I need on Blackboard is the link to your repository. Okay? So to push it to GitHub, so I'm just going to I'll do right now. I'll show you right now. So we did this a few weeks ago, so I'm going to go to GitHub. I'll put the files up right now for you. So I'm going to make a new repository. And I'll call mine COMP2084 Lesson 9. You can just call yours COMP2084 Lab 2. It doesn't matter that you all call it the same name because the names are prefixed by your username. So I'll create, update, and delete with. Okay. So I'll just click Create Repository, gives me a blank repository, and if here's the link to it, so it's github.com/my-username/comp2084 lesson 9. I just copy this URL to the clipboard. Now, I've already logged into Visual Studio. I already have my GitHub credentials logged in here. If I click my solution, right-click it, and choose Add Solution to Source Control. If you haven't done this before, it'll give you 2 options. Use Team Explorer or use Git. Choose Use Git. I won't get that option because I already have logged in and said save that.
So if we've done it before.
If you've done it before, it'll already be here. So then we go to Team Explorer. Again, all these instructions will be on YouTube, and we already did it all together in the instruction on YouTube from a few weeks ago. So in here, if I go to Changes, I'm going to put in the URL. Sorry, I'm going to go to Home and Changes. I'm going to put in a message, so I'll put in End of Lesson 9 Class Files. And I choose Commit and Push. Push means upload. So I push, and it says, okay, what repository, where on GitHub is this code going to live? Enter the URL. So here, just right-click and paste in the URL that we copied from here. And click Publish. It says it's been added, the current branch has been published. And now I can just go back and refresh. Now my solution's on GitHub. So if this is your lab, all you then need to do is grab the URL. That's it. Just put the URL on Blackboard, because I can just click on your repository and I can download it from here. It's actually faster for me to download from GitHub than from Blackboard. Blackboard's a bit clunky. So all I need is the link. Okay. So I'll actually put this link up right now for you guys. So if you cannot get GitHub to work, again, walk through this from YouTube if you need to. Okay. If you can't get it to work, just zip your solution and upload it to Blackboard. But 20% of the mark is for getting it on GitHub. Okay, so you have until Monday night, which I think is a reasonable amount of time.